Mr. Chair. I see this as more of a discussion amongst us. We don't have the police department here, and we invited the chair of the Police Civilian Review Board, and she's not in the room, is she? She's been unable to come and kind of describe that process to us as well. I mean, my two concerns here really revolve around our responsibility as a legislative body. I mean, I think our unique responsibility is to express public voices. We're the ones who are elected as representatives of the people, and without getting too abstract into what that might mean, it really is that the other voices in this conversation, and I've heard this too much from the police chief, have been overly administrative. They've been very bureaucratic. He's been saying that, no, we need to hold on to and not violate the due process rights of officers involved in shootings, for example, and that means the public, you get no information. To me, that's not being responsive enough. And I think we have a very strong responsibility as elected representatives to increase that responsiveness, as well as transparency. So knowing what the review process is, whether that's just an internal affairs process, whether that goes to a civilian review board, those are the things that the public needs to know. And that's why we're here having these discussions, not only about the use of lethal force by police, but also the whole process of investigating and prosecuting sexual assault cases. The public needs to know what these processes are, and I think this is the correct forum for us to give light to those processes. And I think that's very much within our duty to do so as elected voices. So I think I'd like to talk a little bit to you guys, and my item has been covered by Brian Fulmer.
Yes.
And we focused on kind of two issues, or I'm focusing on two issues. There's this issue of training and whether non-lethal force training is sufficient or not. And it depends on who you ask. We got a transmission from the police chief that went through the mayor's office that listed the training that they have now, which was really good to know, and some suggestions for improvements. And I really commend the chief for kind of getting off top dead center on this, and hopefully on the sexual assault issue as well, because we need him to be less tone deaf than he has been. And our role is to make sure that popular voices are heard here, and I'm taking that very seriously. And the second is of transparency. We need to know, and the public needs to know, what the processes are for reviewing controversial cases, and especially those where our citizens or our citizens' property or citizens' pets are being killed. It's very important. It's an essential justice issue, just as essential is whether we're investigating in the right way sexual assault cases. These are questions of justice, and they're the very reasons why government exists. If justice is too expensive, like the police chief has said, it's not doing its job, and we know that's constitutionally unsound. You can't deny justice because it's too expensive. And our issues with our citizenry needing to trust our police couldn't be any more important. They're incredibly important, and I hope we take that seriously as a body. So, Brian, could you summarize as best you could how you understand the current training regime in non-lethal force? I know the police chief offered us a bunch of different courses that police officers get when they're in training, and a lot of them were kind of social worky, how to deal with people on the street who may have mental health issues. And unfortunately, our police are put in that position pretty often. But when it comes down to the really tough decision, the split-second decision that a police officer has to make, whether they're going to use lethal force or not, what sort of training do you see existing currently for that sort of really tough decision that officers have to make in those situations? Can you tell us what the chief told us in his transmittal?
Yes. As you mentioned, he outlined several courses, many of them dealing with people with mental illnesses, but there is a basic use of force course that police officers go through, And in that, they cite different cases, and it's in your packets. But there are a number of cases that they cite, as I mentioned, that deal with when is police use of force justified, and different cases that outline court decisions.
And that's one course, isn't it? I'm looking at, there's
Yes.
a basic use of force course, and that's singular.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
I noticed that the chief suggested perhaps the purchase of a training simulator, a simulation machine that physicians usually use for various scenarios, right, where you can't have a live patient there. It seems like this might be pretty helpful for them, a simulator where you can practice these situations that officers, are put in, or are very difficult situations. Do you have any insight on that proposal by him?
Well, I can't weigh in on what the chief is thinking in the administration, other than to repeat what they've provided. They believe that the training simulator that you reference will help officers practice making critical split-second decisions on how much force to use. And they cite some different studies, the police chief does, and doesn't go into detail, but says that there are studies that have shown better training for officers can reduce the number of officer-involved shootings.
Okay, and this would be part of that training.
That is what the simulator is designed to do.
Just a quick clarification.
Yeah.
We own a simulator at the Pioneer Precinct for tasers specifically. How is what the chief proposing different from that?
He doesn't go into detail on what additional functionality or additional benefit there will be, other than additional training will help reduce the number of officer-involved shootings.
Mr. Chair, it occurs to me as we go through both of these conversations, we're going to have a lot of follow-up, and I think it would be important for us to identify specific questions that we need responses from a policy perspective, or from an implementation perspective from the chief and the police department. So I'm not sure how we're planning on capturing that. I know the staff's really good at taking notes, but there are going to be some really specific questions, I think, that we're going to want to be clear on as we transmit those.
And I appreciate that, Stan, because I'm at the question point of, so could we ask the chief how he thinks the one course on lethal force, how that is either sufficient or insufficient, and the simulator question with Councilmember Lamalfa's added inquiry.
Cindy.
Interject a question there. We should first ask if it's correct that there is only one course. I don't know that that's correct, so we would ask that as our first question.
And then the issue of transparency of review processes. A couple of years ago, Councilmember Soren Simonson and Vice Chair Charlie Luke had as their practice trying to get as many of our board chairs in front of the council to discuss issues, challenges that they have. And I think we really need to hear from the Civilian Review Board of the police, as well as an update for the public's sake of how the police deal with controversial cases. And that process is very important, but also I'd like to I make the point that that the public doesn't deserve swift justice, but they deserve transparent process. And it seems that we may be overbalanced in our keeping the process closed for the due process rights of the officers involved, to a point that's too heavy towards the administrative and legalistic side, and that more public transparency would do a lot of good. Not just we're waiting till the investigation is over, but rather we have hard dates where we can offer this type of information so that the public feels that the process is legit. And I'm not sure many members of the public feels that it is legit, and we have a long way to go in restoring or creating that credibility. So I'd like the Chief's suggestions on how to improve that credibility of the process in the eyes of the public.
Councilmember Adams.
Brian, I was interested. I did not note if this training is a one-time thing when you're a new officer, or if you're required to do it like you do in other professions, that you have to have continuing training or education. And maybe I just missed that, but that if it's not in there, I think that's a question that's important to ask. And then in the transmittal from the chief, when he talked about the training that's coming this fall, it was also unclear to me if that was for new officers or if it was for everybody in the department.
We'll find out about that.
Thank you.
It wasn't specified.
Thanks.
Councilmember Penfold.
Two issues, I think, for follow-up that I hope that we can have a discussion at this level on in the future. This issue is certainly not unique to Salt Lake City, and particularly recently with national incidences. And so I'm particularly concerned about this training and what it looks like. I mean, we're talking about whether or not we have a training, but also what kind of training we have. And I would really like some information on sort of whether or not that's a national standard training, and what are the criteria for that training, what are the expectations from the training, what are the options in particular for training. And certainly a training can be developed that favors less use of lethal force than other trainings might. So I don't know that it's sufficient to require a training. I think it's really important what components that training addresses, and getting into those sort of detailed policy discussions about that's going to be really important going forward. So I hope we don't gloss over this as yes, we have a training, no, we don't have a training, or yes, we'll implement a training going forward. The other topic that is a really hot topic nationally as well is the use of body cams. And there are some reports that suggest that it reduces the use of force, and there are a lot of questions that come up around the violation of privacy. But I think that's certainly relevant to this discussion, is whether or not how we feel about the use of body cams, and whether we support that, and whether we have research that demonstrates it makes a difference, and how we would propose balancing that with privacy issues if we go forward with that. But I don't want to miss that in this opportunity as well.
Great. Thank you. Luke, other thoughts? Okay. I'll turn the time over to Councilmember LaMalfa to talk about the sexual assault adjudication process.